Shalom to everyone. This week we are going to read the Parashat of Mishpatim, which we find in chapters 21 verse 1 of Exodus, meaning ordinances. So this week the Parashat in a nutshell covers basically various laws. Laws of slavery, of murder, other violent offenses, property rights, theft, and even other laws. And then the parasha then finishes this week as Moses and the elders are ascending to the mountain to actually then get some more laws from God himself. So this week is a difficult parasha to read, as some of these things that we are reading, specifically around slavery and murder, are things that we as a society do not do today, and we would read these things and we would ask, but how is it possible that this could even be almost be in the Torah, and how can we apply it in so many senses? So first we have to just look at today's, let's call it, mindset, that most people think of religion as a matter of there is an everyday life circumstances, and then there is spirituality. And these two are not always, they do not always come together. So we see that in religion, sometimes the mindset of holiness is seen as a complete separation from this everyday life and the spiritual life. And then the focus is then to grow into the spiritual life, and then the everyday life is just something that is on the wayside. So we can see that this is almost a mindset in the Western man, because there's a differentiate between the church and the state. So what happens in the church and what happens in the state is not necessarily needs to come together. But with God, there is no realm of religion separation from spirituality and from the everyday concerns of day-to-day life. With God and with the Torah, it gives us exactly this viewpoint, that what we do in our everyday life and what we do in what we call the matters of the heart, or the spiritual matters, are literally one thing. And Torah knows no such distinction. All areas of life are intertwined. And holiness, derived from the correct business dealings, is no less than any spiritual matters, or let's call piety, from in the matters of the heart. So a business dealing with a neighbor, a business dealing within everyday business life, is as important and on the same level as some of the spiritual matters. And this is exactly what we see in this outline of the parasha this week, that God gives laws that is not just for the spiritual man, is not focusing on spirituality, but it is able to be applied on an everyday to day life. So we see one who wishes to be a righteous or devoutly pious person should be scrupulous in matters of everyday life and a day-to-day life circumstances, as well as in the matters of the heart. So there's not one spirituality where on once a week I am spiritual, but the rest of the week that doesn't really count. A righteous and a pious person devotes himself in a 6-day week as well as in the 7th day in all these matters. So for the Torah, the concept of the civil, which we know that there are the description and the distinction between civil laws and moral laws, but the concept in the Torah that the civil in the courtroom, and let's call in the civil world, and the moral in the temple in the place of worship, is not separate, but it is intertwined and inseparable. So what you do in your civilian world and surrounding, and what you do in a moral standing in a place of worship, is so intertwined that one influences the others. So we can see from the previous parasha that the 10 commandments can be separated into basically two distinct categories. The one is commandments towards the service of God, and let's call it loving, the loving God. And then there are a distinction or separation of laws that is service to your fellow man, loving your neighbor. So we can see that that in the description of the 10 commandments, there are basically two levels: one serving God and one serving God through serving your fellow man. And if we look at verse 1 of this week, chapters 21, verse 1, we'll see that it starts with ve'ele. So if we look at ve'ele ha-mishpatim, it says ve, meaning and some of those translations do not consider, they just start these are the rules, and some of the translations do recognize the va, the vav, and it says ve'ele, and these are the rules that you shall set before them, meaning that the Torah here connects what was given as the 10 commandments and the following ordinances and decrees as binding together. So therefore there is no mindset of that the 10 commandments are seen higher than the other ordinances, the Mishpatim, and decrees, the Chukim. The Torah in verse 1, Ve'ele, ties both of these together. It ties both of these to being given together at Mount Sinai. So too now can we see that the Mishpatim and the Chukim that is given to us in the following passages are also then divided and can be divided into two categories. One is a service to God, a loving God, by keeping the Mishpatim and Chukim, and many of the laws that we would see is that there is a service to God through the service to man, loving your neighbor. So both the 10 commandments and the ordinances, the decrees, are basically then divided in the same two categories: loving God and loving your neighbor. Now, of the 613 commandments, we see that 248 positive commandments, only 126 are currently applicable. And of the 365 negative commandments, only 243 are still applicable. So in total nowadays we can say that the 369 mitzvot are still operative from the 613. So the question would be, but if this is the case, why even necessary to read these laws, to even know these laws, these ordinances, and what is basically the use of them? So if we look at Devarim, Deuteronomy 4, from the Amplified, it says that, "Look, I have taught you statutes and judgment, just as the Lord my God commanded me, so that you may do them in the land which you are entering to possess. So keep and do them, for this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples, who will hear these statutes and say, surely this is a great nation, is a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as the Lord our God, whenever we call upon him? Or what great nation has statutes and judgments so righteous as this whole law which I am placing before you today? So Moses in the book of Deuteronomy gives us three distinct things. That these laws and statutes, the statutes and judgments, the Mishpatim and Chokim, are something that he had to taught, and something that needs to be taught from one generation to another generation. And what are we to teach? And what had he teach them? He taught them to do and to keep them, to keep and to do them. And he specifically says, because this is your wisdom and understanding. Because great nations will say, which nations are there that have statutes and judgments so righteous? So from this we can see that clearly the Torah is stating that the Mishpatim and the Chokim are righteous. And it clearly states, because it is righteous, it is our wisdom and our understanding in the sight of all the people who will hear and see these statutes. And then thirdly, these need to be taught to the people. So if we then go to Matthew 5, where Yeshua says, do not think that I come to do away with or undo the law, meaning the Torah, the law of Moses, or the writings of the prophets. I do not come to destroy them, but to fulfill. For I assure you, and most solemnly say to you, until heaven and earth passes away, not one small letter of the stroke of the pen will pass from the Torah. So even one yud will be taken away from the Torah until all things are accomplished. So whoever breaks one of these least important of these commandments and teaches others to do so the same will be called the least important in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches them, he will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So even Yeshua now clearly states in Matthew 5 that he did not come to destroy this wisdom and this understanding before the eyes of the nations, these chukim, these mishpatim and chukim, which are clearly righteous according to Deuteronomy 24, chapter 4, and that whoever breaks one of these and teaches others to do the same will be called the least. But those who practice and teach will be called basically the greatest or great in the kingdom of heaven. So we can see that both these scriptures tell us that which is written in the Torah, let's call it the whole scripture, the Tanakh as well as the Brit Chadashah, the whole scripture, there is wisdom, there is understanding, there is righteousness within the writings of the complete scriptures. And it is for us to teach, to understand, because this will become our wisdom. So if some of these things are then not so important, or let's say if some of them are clearly not applicable today, then why is it important that we even understand and even look at this? Because clearly it can't be wisdom and understanding before the eyes of the nations, because some of these things don't even that they can't even be applied today. And many commentaries would actually then even say that everything, all the Torah, Mishpatim, the Chukim, the laws and the statutes have been fulfilled. But the reality is some of these laws, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, and thou shalt not steal, is not something that can just be fulfilled. It's something that's part of a society, that's part of an everyday life, and it is something to be done in an everyday life. Now, many people do not have a problem. They shall not kill. They shall not steal. But some people do. On a daily basis, they have to think, and they have to direct their actions to honor their father and their mother. They shall not commit adultery. They shall not bear false witness. Even in today, the tongue is loose, and so this will be applying on an everyday basis, that thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. So some of these things are just not being able to just be fulfilled. It's something that needs to be applied even in an everyday life. So we are going to read laws within this parasha that is so difficult that we ask ourselves, how can it even be applied today? How can it even be still written in the Torah? It's not for us. It's just impossible to look at some of these laws and say, okay, we have to apply it or make it applicable in our lives today. And the only way that we can actually look at some of these Torah laws is to first understand the underlying principle of the Torah law. So the definition of principle is that it's a fundamental truth. It's a proposition that serves as the foundation for a system of belief or behavior. So it's something just fundamental truth, and therefore I believe it, and it changes my behavior or implements a certain behavior, and in a case even a chain of reasoning. So the only way to look at some of these laws that might not be applicable today because the society has changed, and therefore some of these laws cannot be applied directly today, but there is an underlying principle to every law that is a fundamental truth. If this is not the case, then we would ask ourselves, but why is the complete scripture, these pages, these laws, still then given to us? Why wasn't it removed? And the fact that it is still with us today, what do I do with these laws? Do I skip them? Do I read them? Do I study them? Do I just ignore them because it's not something that it's applicable today? No, there are some principles within this whole Torah layout that is so powerful that it creates or it establishes why factor is. I know, because most of the people would ask, why do I do this? What is the purpose of this? But the principle will place within an individual this powerfulness of knowing exactly why. Now the chukim, we do not understand always the chukim. Some of these laws are just not understandable. For instance, we shall not eat then unclean meat, and pork is part of the unclean meat. But why wasn't it a sheep called unclean and pork clean? Why? So some of these questions cannot be answered because the Creator designated that a pig shall be unclean and a sheep shall be clean. But it establishes a different why factor. Why are we then doing that specific Torah law? is because God, the creator of heaven, has given this. So there are principles that subconsciously turn to this underlying fundamental truth within each law in a time of uncertainty. So we see, for instance, there are certain things that individuals do, and then you're asking the questions, but why did you do it? And they would answer and say, well, it's the right thing to do. And we know that the prophets talk about this, that God says to Jeremiah, and I will place my laws within their hearts. So there are subconscious principles that has been placed upon us, and it is a fundamental truth why we do some of these things. But some of the other Torah laws are more difficult to understand, and therefore we have to then revert back to this underlying principles in times of crisis and urgencies. This principle needs to shape our action in everyday life and family life. So we see that many do not understand the principles of the instructions. And I call it instructions because this is what Torah is actually. It's instructions. It's not just law. The translation of law provides such a negative connotation. It's an instruction to everyday life. And therefore, the people come to, because they don't understand it, they have the first reaction, well, I don't understand the laws of this and this and that, and therefore I completely discard this wisdom that has been given to us basically in Scripture for us. And the second is that, we still don't understand the principle of this law, but I know that somehow we have to fulfill it, and therefore turn their attention on this fancy methods of application into our lives. So then we find under communities the same type of Torah law that has been implemented this way and that way, and you have to use this type of name and you have to use that type of name, and you get these various fancy applications. And I would say it's because the understanding of the underlying fundamental truth is not part of the individual's DNA yet. So if we have to start talking about the principle of a Torah law, we would say, why is the Torah law given to us? Well, it is to change a certain behavior. So if you want to change the behavior, then you should not focus on the method of changing the behavior, or providing information in order, or let's call it a revelation. Specifically under some of the communities, we are looking for new revelations every day because we think that this is the root of a changing of behavior. But we shouldn't be focusing on methods or even on new revelation to change behavior, but we have to start with a principle why these things are so important. And as we do this, we have to apply this type of thinking and application to the physical Torah laws that we are reading within this parasha. So we have to first identify, if we read a Torah law, which we will read some examples, we first have to think about the underlying, and we have to identify the underlying principle of that law. So identifying the underlying principle is the first step to changing and strengthening the application of that law in our everyday life. So if we understood the principle of the Torah law given in that time, then we can also then apply that principle in our life. The method and the process might change from that which has been in ancient Near East to modern times, but the principle still stays the same. So if we look at some of these examples, and I'm just going to take 3 examples because it's probably the 3 most difficult ones to think or to understand, because it's not part of our society today. And therefore, how would I apply them then in my everyday life? And the one would be slavery. So we read in the Parashat today, there are laws around slavery. So the first question is how is this even applicable to me? Because slavery is abolished. So slavery is not part of our society. I've never owned a slave. I will never buy a slave. And therefore, how can some of these things be even applicable to me? And even what is the use of reading and trying to understand the laws on slavery? So first we have to take a step back and just realize that slavery was a reality in the times in ancient societies. It was something that was real. Slaves were bought and sold, and it was part of ancient society. So when Moses wrote the Torah, and he heard and wrote the Torah from God, there were ancient societies that had slaves. They had ways of dealing with their slaves. They had methods of dealing with their slaves. And there was trading of slaves between various ancient nations. And slaves were seen as a normal commodity. And the effects of this ancient slavery aren't as tangible today, because we cannot think about trading slaves today, even seeing as a slave as a commodity like a car. And most, even today, only have a vague idea of even the circumstances of slavery and even what it looked like. And because there are kinds of slavery that took place so long ago, and some people have the impression that, well, it wasn't that harsh or that violent, therefore some of these things are applicable or not applicable. Today we just don't have an idea really of what slavery entailed and what was slavery like in ancient societies. But this is where the Torah law today gives us a hint, because what happened in ancient society, we see according to Deuteronomy 4, that God is going to give Torah laws that is more righteous and with more wisdom than ancient societies. So even if slavery was a reality, the way that Israel will be implementing slavery will be in a righteous manner. It will be in a matter of wisdom, so that other nations would say, what other nation does have such righteous law as the nation of Israel? So it's not that the Torah gives its stamp of approval on slavery, but it has taken a problem within ancient societies and addressed it in a more humane, a more wisdom understanding, in a more righteous way. So we can see that in ancient Near East, and even later on the classical Greece and even Rome, slavery was pervasive. It was discriminatory. It was really a cruel practice. So therefore we would recognize then that the Torah would implement then something that would be against this pervasive discriminatory and cruel actions. It would give something different to the nation of Israel. So as a result, then God gives the statutes and judgments around slavery that is righteous so much righteous that other nations will say, surely this is a great nation. It's wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has a God that gives them such righteous uh, ordinances and statutes? So when we read now the laws of slavery, we can see that God gave it because of the 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 ancient Near Eastern society issues with slavery, and that he is implementing a system where other people would say, well, this is a wise and understanding people. And we see that even further than that, that if the nation of Israel do not implement this righteous statutes and judgments, it could be also said in the same way that they are an unwise and they have no understanding, this people. Therefore, the repercussions of not keeping to this laws that has been given around slavery uh, is then also carries then a penalty for let's call the slave owner. So we see that as much as the Torah law starts giving us now Torah instructions around slavery, it is not because it condones or it agrees with the laws of slavery or even the concept of slavery. In actual fact, it implements something different in order to work against the ancient Near Eastern mindset of slavery. So therefore, slavery is abolished today. So we would ask our question today, but why would I even want to read this? How can it even be applied to me? I'll just skip this section because it's just not applicable. But remember the underlying principle. Each of these laws have an underlying fundamental truth that we can apply in our daily lives, even if it's not fully under the banner of slavery, but something different. And let's take for the first example the Exodus 21 verse 2, where the Torah tells us when you acquire a Hebrew slave, that person shall serve 6 years and shall go free in the 7th year without payment. So the first section of this scripture, we know it talks about a Hebrew slave. It talks actually about your neighbor. It talks about your brother. It doesn't talk about somebody far off. It talks about those that are among you. So the principle is that we first have to look at is those people that are among you. And we know the Hebrews or the Israelites could only become a slave in basically two manners. And the first one, we know that the Hebrew Israelites can only become a slave because of extreme poverty. Now, the extreme poverty could be for various reasons. He could have been a lazy person. He could have been just misfortune or circumstances that he fell into extreme poverty. It does not address the fact why, but it just says that your brother finds himself in extreme poverty, and then he comes and he sells himself as an escape of the circumstances. So the Torah law tells us here, in this first case, that this person shall only serve you for a period of time, and then in this time he shall be then looked after, and you shall basically help him to come out of his extreme poverty. And the 7th year you shall let him go without payment, without paying you back for this, let's say, the services or the kindness that you have showed him. So in extreme poverty, we know that you have to treat him. There's other Torah laws that we would read that would basically stem from this specific one, is that we know that you cannot treat your fellow Israelite, your fellow neighbor, even your fellow family, like a normal slave. You cannot treat him like somebody from a different nation. You have to treat him almost as a child of your house. You have to look after him. You have certain responsibility to him, and there are certain commentaries from the rabbis that basically say, he that acquires him a slave acquires himself a great responsibility. So, so basically, it's just not acquiring a slave, but there is a huge responsibility that comes onto the owner to look after the slave. He needs to treat him on a certain way. And basically, he needs to make sure that the slave under him basically comes out of his poverty. So in the 7th year, he can be released in order to carry on with his life, and you have to release him without payment. Then the second way a fellow Hebrew slave can become, or a fellow Israelite can become a slave, is when he's been caught as a thief. But in this second circumstances, it is not for you to determine to buy a thief or not. In actual fact, it goes through a process of court of law. So there are credible witnesses that have to be in process. There has to be righteousness. There's so many other laws that somebody come into to play before you can just declare somebody a thief. And only in this case, when all these conditions have been fulfilled, then the court is allowed to sell this person as a slave, because he was a thief, in order to repay the cost to the victim. So we can see in both of these cases, in the 7th year, in 6 years, he would need to work out of poverty, or in the case of a thief, he needs to work back the fact that he owes the victim, and then on the 7th year, then he can be released. So this is the short underlying principle. We can even go in more depth, but it's a very high level looking at the specific verse 2. So the question is how do we apply this in today's life? Because we don't have a Hebrew slave. We don't even have the concept of every 7 years that we release people, and even thieves, the court of law puts them into jail, and therefore, this law cannot be applied. Surely it cannot be applied to me or even in my circumstances. But the underlying principle truth can still be applied. Because the reality today is we do find in today's uncertain economy situations that people come to fellow people and say, please, can you just give me a job? I just need I just need employment. I just need to make enough money in order to feed my family. And we're not even talking about far off nations. We're talking about even individuals within our own society that we can see, that we are literally involved in an everyday life, that we can see is falling into a situation of extreme poverty. And when we do encounter a person like this, where he says that I'll work for minimum wage, I would work extreme hours, I would do anything that I can do in order to escape this situation, then this principle of the Torah law will apply to the one that will also help him. In a case that you shall then set a fixed period for him in order to get out of his poverty. It's almost your it is your duty to make sure that you have a plan in place in order to help this individual to come outside of his poverty. And if we have to apply it exactly in the way that the Torah tells us here, in 6 years he shall do it, and in the 7th year he shall be out of the circumstances. And we see this specifically still being applied to in the Jewish community today. That within the community, it is not enough to just provide somebody with money in order. It's easy to give money and say, well, here's money, go away, and then you do not get involved in his everyday life. But I have encountered myself in the Jewish community where they look at employment, they're looking at setting up your own business, they actually looking at far more than just providing a requirement or need at this moment, but they're looking at helping each other to have a long-lasting system of rising above this poverty. And the difficulty with implementing this even today means you have to get involved with individuals. You have to be involved with their problems. And I have so many of my own problems. But this is a Torah principle. The Torah principle tells us that you must love your neighbor like yourself. You must get involved with him in such a manner that his life must be worth to you like your own life. This is the reality, and I think this is why so many people are very eager to just basically be helping from a far off place. So as much as we say, well, slavery is not applicable today, but the principle that this Torah law teaches us, we are able to apply within our modern society. Now, it is from case to case basis. I've said a lot of things that is perhaps not even applicable in some of the cases. It's not even applicable in your life, because you might be in the same situation of trying to get out of this extreme situations. But when we are in a position to look at this Torah law, we can remind ourselves, even if I employ somebody in dire need for a period of a week or 2 days or 3 days, even 1 day, then it shall be that I shall send him out then without requiring from him a payback for my services. I help him, and therefore in the end of this today I said, well, I've helped you here, I've helped you there, and therefore you owe me this. You should do it without payment, and you should let him go. And the same with some other circumstances. With a thief, when you realize, or when a person comes to you and he tells you that, and he has remorse, and he tells you about he might have been involved in some shady business, it is required then, obviously by the court, to let the legal process go. But if he comes to you and says, I need to repay you, or I want to repay you, then the principle is you need to allow him to let you pay back what he has stolen. Unfortunately today, the legal system is in such a way that people go to jail and they come out without righteousness being given to the victims. There's no payback. There's no righteousness given to the victim. Hence the fact that some of these things can only, its value and its wisdom and righteousness can only come to fluence when the kingdom of heaven is set up by the Mashiach. So if we basically then also look at another example, which is so far from removed from our daily society today, is in chapters 21 verse 15. It says, one who strikes one's father or mother shall be put to death. Surely this cannot be applied, because who would put their son in their children, who would put their children in any case to death? And even if you have the circumstances that you want to do it, it's illegal. You cannot do it. So this Torah law is so far removed that it's impossible to implement, and therefore I'll just skip over it and we'll just say it's not applicable. As we fill in forms, we just say not applicable, not applicable, and sometimes this is the way that Torah has been read. Not applicable, not applicable, not applicable, without taking cognizance of the underlying fundamental truth. So we see in this case that this one of striking one's father or mother is in contrast with what God has given in Exodus 20:12, of honoring your father and your mother, so that your days may be prolonged in the land the Lord God gives you. So we see the first Torah law that has been given is honor your father and your mother. And that will come with a length of your life. So when you disregard this Torah and you go to the opposite side and you strike one's father and mother as a sign of disrespect, then your life shall be shortened. So why is this so important, and why does it carry such a huge penalty? Because this commandment is built upon a principle that this is a service to God. And how can it be a service to God? It is because, firstly, the individual did not choose to be born. God decided for him to be born. God decided to give him life, and this was a free gift. You did not choose your parents. God, the knower of the creation, the ruler of the creation, knew that giving you the parents was the right thing to do. So therefore you do not have the choice, or you cannot choose your parent. God has chosen it for you. So by honoring your father and mother is by honoring God's decision to give you the specific mother and father. And by honoring them, you lengthen your life, and this is a gift that you give basically back to God, saying that I value the decision of my mother and father, and therefore the length of life. But some people, they disregard the value of life, and then would get involved in things that would shorten their life, or the possibility of shortening their life, because they disregard the value of what God has given them. So in this underlying principle here, we see that one who strikes your father and mother is actually dishonoring God. And dishonoring God is because He's the one that has given you your father and your mother. And you dishonor Him because the first commandment that was given before this is that you should honor your father and your mother, so that your days may be prolonged. So now we get to the application of these days, and we have seen so many kids, even young children, they throw a tantrum, and they go and they hit their father and their mother, and they get angry with them, and they show him disrespect. Does that mean that we have to put these children to death? God forbid, it's not the case. But one who strikes one's father, mother, there's circumstances on that it's almost in a case that it's a violent abuse to almost kill one's father and mother. So an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. So if it's in the circumstances that a child comes to a father and mother violently in order to basically take their life shall be taken as well. So we cannot take life. We are not in a court of law, but we have to follow the processes, the legal processes, in order for righteousness to be applied. We cannot leave. Parents cannot leave their children in the circumstances that they are. They have to involve the community. They have to involve sometimes the police. It's the duty of the parents in order to do this. They cannot just let it go, because this young boy or young child might grow into an adult that's even more violent. So it is the responsibility of the parents to discipline their children. So all these are underlying principles that we can get from this one Torah law, that one shall not just stand by. A father and mother cannot stand by letting the children abuse them, even to such a point where they in fear of their life. They have to act upon it, and it's their duty. That death means separation, that even it could be that this individual or the son or this child needs to be separated, and if it's a process of jail time or even some counseling or whatever. I'm highlighting a high overview principle. Each circumstances are so unique that we would need to look at the principle and apply that. But this is something that we can look at and just not disregard and say, well, this is not really applicable in today's society, and therefore I just write it as not applicable and I pass on to that. So the third example, when we look at Exodus 21:35, is when any party's ox injures a neighbor's ox and it dies. So I don't know how many farmers are among our community, but I'm not a farmer, so therefore I can say, well, I don't have an ox walking around in my premises. I would never even have an ox, and therefore this would not even apply to me. But the underlying fundamental truth can still be applied. And this fundamental truth of this is that this commandment is from God in service to your fellow man. So by abiding to this law and in service to your fellow man, you are actually honoring God. But this underlying principle in this specific verse 35 teaches the owner's responsibility. It teaches about settling of damages. So we can take this and we can take this underlying principle apart, and we can see, well, I don't have an ox, but I am an employer, and I have machinery that might not be in a good condition. And eventually, when I do not take cognizance of this machinery, and I do not take cognizance of the person working on this machinery, and he gets injured, there will be a settling of damages. And if it comes to an extreme that the business or even the machinery needs to be sold in order to settle the damages, this is the underlying principle. It needs to be done. The owner has a responsibility, even if it's an ox, a car. If I'm going to borrow you my car, but I know that the car is in such a condition that you are able to get into an accident, I have the responsibility to say no. I have the responsibility that if you're in desperate need of the car, to fix it, because I will be liable for some damages. So in this three specific examples, and there are so many other examples in today's Torah portion, I can only highlight this, but the application of underlying fundamental truths are present in every Torah, Mishpatim, and Chokim. And therefore, we have the duty to teach. We have the duty to implement. We have the duty to understand. And in that, we can say we have a service to God and we have a service to our fellow man. Now, by no means was this explanation in these three examples so easy. And this is not just one way of applying it and saying, well, this is the way. It could be in so many different ways, but God wants to teach us a fundamental truth. And we have to not just tick it as not applicable. We have to study the Torah principles. We have to recognize and identify the underlying truths. And we have to apply that in our lives where applicable. And with that, I would wish you a peaceful Shabbat. I would wish you that God would highlight these underlying truths in everything that we read. And may this be a light upon our path. And with this, I would wish you a Shabbat Shalom. And we wish a Shalom to everyone in Israel, in the circumstances, and a peace upon the nation of Israel. Amen.